Hilchos Korban Pesach Perek Asiri, the laws of the Passover sacrifice, chapter 10. This is the last chapter. Today we're concluding this set of laws with God's help. The main focus today is the special prohibition that applies to the Passover sacrifice, not to break any bones. Both the first and the second Pesach, while eating it, we're not to break any bones. Whether it's for a purpose, you want to get the marrow out of it, or for any other reason, breaking bones is prohibited. And there's a lot of discussion in the commentaries. What is the reason for this prohibition? We're going to suffice with the simple explanation given by the Chinuch. The Chinuch writes that it's simply not respectful. Poor people, hungry people, break into bones to get out the last juices, the last marrows. Tonight on Pesach night, we're supposed to act like rich people, like sons of kings. It's just not befitting. We shouldn't be breaking bones looking for extra marrow. That's the perspective we're going to offer today. Of course, there are philosophical, theological perspectives, Kabbalistic perspectives, Hasidic perspectives, but I'll leave that to the student. And if you know any specific explanation, if you can please leave it in the comments, I'd very much appreciate to see that. And then at the end, we're going to talk also about the Chagiga, the additional celebratory sacrifice that would accompany the Korban Pesach, even though tomorrow we're about to enter a full set of laws called Hilchos Chagiga, where we'll delve more into that. But today we're going to talk about it as it relates to the Passover sacrifice. It says the Rambam halacha aleph hashover etzem bepesach toher. If somebody breaks a bone in a pure Korban Pesach, pure meaning, we saw in chapter 7, let's say a couple of examples where if most of the community is impure, then the Passover sacrifice was brought in impurity and it was also eaten in impurity. The law we're going to discuss today only applies to a pure Passover sacrifice. Anybody who breaks a bone in a pure Passover sacrifice, harei zeloike, he gets lashes. Shenemar, because it says clearly in the Torah, ve'etzem leisish beruvai, you shall not break a bone in the Passover sacrifice. V'chei nemar bePesach sheni, it says the same thing when it comes to the second Passover. Ve'etzem lo yish beruvai, they shall not break a bone in it. Aval Pesach sheba betuma, but if it's a Passover sacrifice being offered in a state of ritual impurity, im shavar be'etzem eni loika, if you broke a bone in it, we can't give you lashes. Because we learn from tradition to interpret this verse that we just quoted, Loisish beruvai means betaher, v'loi betame. Don't break a bone in it means it when it's pure, not it when it's impure. It doesn't matter what time you broke the bone, whether it was on the night of the 15th when it's supposed to be eaten, or while it was still day, or even after many days. You always get lashes. There's an essential prohibition of breaking the bones in the Passover sacrifice. Halacha beis lefichach, therefore, serfin atzmeis haPesach bichlal hanoisar mi besarai. The custom is to burn all the bones of the Passover sacrifice together with whatever meat is left over, so you don't come to any problems. If you would leave the bones out, somebody wouldn't realize, break the bone, he's breaking the bone of a Korban Pesach. So whatever you do with the leftover meat, which is you burn it, also you should do with the bones, add it to the fire. Halacha Gimel, ein chayavin, you're only liable for a specific type of bones. Elal shviras etzem sheyesh alav kazayis basar sheyesh b'mayach. You're only liable for breaking of a bone that has on it an olive-sized portion of flesh, or it has marrow. Aval etzem she'ein b'mayach v'she'ein alav kazayis basar. But if you have a bone with no marrow and it doesn't have any flesh on it, at least an olive-sized portion, you're not liable for breaking it. That's not the bone that Torah was talking about. Just as an incidental side note, did a little research here, and it seems like the way the marrow works, when the animal is very small, there's basically no marrow or some red marrow, then the yellow marrow, this is like the juicy marrow, spreads into the bone as the animal matures, and in some bones it even goes all the way around the bone. From my research, again, if you know anything different, please post it in the comments. What I've seen is that pretty much the animals that are kosher for Passover sacrifice, sheep, lambs, and goats, every bone in it has marrow. So what does the Rambam mean when he says a bone that doesn't have marrow? It's very possible that he's referring to the flat bones, in the skull and in the ribs, that while they have marrow, there's no marrow sac. In other words, there's no location where the marrow collects. It's just spread all over the bone. So maybe, I'm just saying as a suggestion, maybe that's what the Rambam is referring to when he says etzem she'ein b'mayach. There you wouldn't be liable for breaking it because the marrow isn't in a specific place, so you're not breaking open to get, let's say, to get access to that marrow. Let's say the bone had an olive-sized portion of meat on it, but you broke the bone not where the meat is. Chayav, you're still liable. Even though, again, the place that you broke is empty of meat, it doesn't matter. You broke a bone with meat on it, you're liable. Halacha dalad hashever achar hashever be'etzem echad. If somebody breaks after somebody else breaks in the same bone, loika, you still get lashes, because each break stands on its own. Halacha hey hasoyref atzamayis v'hamechatech gidim. If somebody were to burn bones or cut apart different sinews, einay chayav mishum shviras etzem, you're not liable for breaking a bone because you didn't break a bone. Halacha vav pesach shehuna oy mevushal. If you have a Passover sacrifice that was prepared in an improper way, it's either only partially roasted but mostly raw, or it was cooked in water or another juice. V'shavar boyasa etzem, and you broke a bone in such a Passover sacrifice, loike, you still get lashes. Afilu nifsal betuma v'yitzia v'chayetzebem. Even if the whole sacrifice became disqualified because it became impure or it left the premises of Jerusalem or anything like that, yesh boy isur shviras ha'etzem, the prohibition of breaking bones still applies to it. Well, we said before in the beginning of the chapter that a Passover sacrifice offered in impurity doesn't have the law of breaking bones. That's if it was offered in impurity. Here you have a Passover that was offered in purity and it just became impure later. The law still applies. But Medvarim says that Rambam, again, making this point, when do we say this? If at one point it was kosher and later it became disqualified. But if there's a Passover sacrifice that never had a moment when it was kosher, it became pigul, either because it was made with an improper time thought or an improper name thought, you had in mind the wrong sacrifice. There is no prohibition of breaking a bone because it never was a kosher sacrifice to begin with. If you break the tailbone, these are the tailbones down here. This is a cow, so the Rambam is about to say that doesn't really apply, but a sheep also has a type of a tailbone. If you broke the tailbone, you don't get lashes because it's not fit for eating. Halacha ches, haschusim. Schusim is like, according to the Rambam, cartilage. Shehim kamayatzamim rakim, softer bones. Hare'elu mutarin la'achlan, it's permitted to eat those, even though they take the form of soft bones, but they aren't actually bones. Halacha tes, hayagdi katan barach shatzmoisav rakim. Let's say you brought a Passover sacrifice from a very small and soft kid goat. His bones are soft. Lo yoichal, you still shouldn't eat the bones. You're breaking a bone. If you did, you get lashes. It doesn't matter if you break a soft bone or a hard bone. The rule is, compare it to a big ox. If it were to be a mature ox, and now it's cooked, what can you eat from that ox? That's what you can eat from a soft kid goat after it's been roasted. Anything else not. The edges of the tendons, the cartilage, that's okay to be eaten. That you would eat even in an ox. These are tendons. This is a tendon in a chicken, tendons in a cow. They kind of run along the length of the bones, but they aren't the bone itself. Those are permitted. The same way you would eat it in a big ox, you could eat it in a soft kid goat. But if it's the bone itself, even if it's soft in the kid goat, doesn't make a difference. You can't eat it. Halacha yud gidin harakin shesoifan lahakshos. The thinner or the softer sinews that are going to harden if the animal grows up, even though they are fitting to be eaten, and they could be eaten in the Passover sacrifice, if that's the only part that's left, you can't join Passover sacrifice, you can't RSVP having in mind to only eat those soft sinews, because they're not considered meat on their own. You can join an RSVP, counting on the fact that you're going to eat the brain of the animal because you can access the brain matter without breaking a bone through the nostrils. So if that's all that's left in the Passover sacrifice, you can join the group and have in mind to eat that. We cannot join having in mind to eat the marrow inside the femur or the thigh bone, which is a bone that's shut from both edges, because the only way to get it out is if you break the bones. And breaking the bones, of course, is forbidden with the Passover sacrifice. Typically, when a person eats the Passover sacrifice, he should cut into the meat and eat it as he wishes. The bones, you must cut only at the joints. And by the joints, you can remove them if you want. That's not called breaking a bone. Breaking a bone is breaking within a bone, not breaking bone from bone. When you reach what's called the sciatic nerve, over here, which is forbidden to be eaten in any animal. Moitzioi umanichoi im shara gidim v'ha'atzomes v'ha'krumais sheyotzim b'shas achila. You take it out and you put it aside together with all the other sinews and bones and membranes that must be removed when eating an animal. Today we don't know about this because we don't eat mostly the back half of an animal where all these problematic tissues and membranes are. But when you're eating a whole Korban Pesach, you have to be expert in these laws. And as you eat, you remove the forbidden parts. She'ein menakin oisei kishar abasar, ve'ein mechatchin oisei. Says the Rambam, we don't clean out this meat before roasting it like any other meat you would do. We don't cut it into pieces. You're supposed to specifically roast it whole. If you cut it into pieces before it's still kosher. But ideally, you're supposed to roast it in a completely whole manner. And therefore, since you're roasting it together with the sciatic nerve and together with the problematic fats and membranes and everything, you must be aware to pick them out as you eat. The Ravid, primary commentator on the Rambam, has some very, very harsh words against the Rambam here. He says, how could it be that you would roast an animal together with all of its forbidden stuff inside of it? It's like roasting kosher with not kosher. He says, if I merited to be alive in the times of the temple and somebody would bring me a Passover sacrifice cooked in that way, I would throw it on the ground in his face. And there's big debate how to explain the Rambam's position over here. One of the classic ways is based on what the Rambam said actually himself in the laws of forbidden foods, that if you cook a whole leg of an animal together with the gidanasha, since the sciatic nerve itself doesn't impart any flavor, and any of the other membranes are only forbidden rabbinically, so when it comes to the law of the Korban Pesach, which is a biblical thing, it overrides that, and it's fine. That's the Mari Kurkus, but there's a lot of discussion about this, but the Rambam definitely holds that it was all roasted complete, and it was picked out as you went about the eating. If you cut it before, it's still kosher, so long as you don't miss any of the limbs. Another halacha is, a person needs to try very hard, put in a lot of effort, not to leave any meat of the Passover sacrifice over till morning. Shenemar, because it says, you shall not leave over anything to the morning. Eat it all. Second Passover, same thing. Shenemar, it says, lo yashiru mimenu ad boiker. You shouldn't leave over from it to the morning. If you did leave over first or second Passover, you transgress a negative commandment. However, you don't get lashes for the transgression, because it can be fixed by a positive commandment, as it says in the very next part of the verse, whatever remains to the morning, you should burn it in fire. So since you can fix the leaving over by burning it, so we're not going to hold you liable for punishment for the act of leaving it over. Halacha Yud Beis, here we come to the Chagiga. In general, when we offer the first Passover sacrifice on the 14th of Nisan, there's also a mitzvah to bring along a peace offering on the 14th day, from cattle or sheep, adult or young, male or female, like any other peace offering. This is called the Chagiga, the celebratory sacrifice of the 14th. It's a special thing to bring it together with the Korban Pesach. As we saw the other day, it also helps you eat the Passover sacrifice once you're satiated. Because the sacrifice itself, everybody is counting on it, RSVP to it, to get a little small portion. So you must eat other meat before that to be satiated. About this Chagiga, it actually says in the Torah, V'zavachta Pesach la'Hashem alekecha tzoin uvakar. You shall offer a Passover offering to Hashem, sheep and cattle. What do you mean sheep and cattle? Passover sacrifice has to be a sheep or a lamb, not a cattle. The cattle is referring to the Chagiga, the celebratory sacrifice that accompanies the Passover sacrifice. When would they bring this celebratory sacrifice? If the eve of Passover was on a weekday, and it was being brought in a state of purity, and there wasn't that many people. There wasn't that many Passover sacrifices, But if the 14th was on Shabbos, or the Passover offering is being offered in a state of impurity, or there were too many Passover sacrifices to be taken care of, we don't bring a celebratory sacrifice with it, then we only bring the Passover sacrifices, and that's it, no accompanying Chagiga. Halacha Yud Gimel Chagigas Arba Asar Reshus Ve'eino Chayva. This bringing of the celebratory sacrifice of the 14th is optional. It's not an obligation. It follows the rules of a peace offering. It can be eaten for 2 days and 1 night. But if you offer it, there's a prohibition to leave it over after the 2 days. Shenemar, because it says, V'lo yolid min habasar, asher tizbach ba'erev, b'yom harishen la'boiker. It should not be left overnight. Any of the meat which you offer in the evening, going into the morning after the holiday. Even though it sounds like it's saying b'yom harishen la'boiker, the first morning, it actually means the second morning. We learn from tradition, this is a prohibition for somebody to leave the meat of the celebratory sacrifice to the 16th of Nisan, 2 days later. Because it says an extra word, la boiker, in the morning, ad boiker shal yom hasheni, the morning, second morning. But if you do leave it over, you don't get lashes. You simply burn it like any other nicer, any other leftover sacrificial meat. And that's how you fix the fact that you left it over. Halacha Yudalid B'sar Chagiga Sha'ala Ima Pesach Ala Shulchan. Meat from the Chagiga that was put onto the table together with the Passover sacrifice. V'chala Tavshilin Ha'ilim Imay Ala Shulchan. And all the other cooked foods that were with it on the table, Misbar in Imay, must be burnt with the Passover sacrifice. They convert to the status of the Passover sacrifice. They can only be eaten until the midnight, like the Passover sacrifice itself. That's a decree from the rabbis, so you shouldn't have mixtures, between different meats. Once you put it on the table, it becomes like the Passover sacrifice, and it's treated that much more stringently. And the Rambam concludes with the halacha, Tesvav, Ma bein Pesach Rishon le Pesach Sheni. Let's delineate the differences between the first Passover and the second Passover. Till now, we've been learning laws that apply equally to all of them, but there are some differences. Harishain asur b'chametz b'val yirah b'al yimatzeh. On the first Passover, besides for bringing the Passover sacrifice, there's a prohibition to have any chametz, to see it or to own it. And it cannot be slaughtered if you own any chametz during that time. You cannot remove it from company to company. It requires halal to be recited when you eat it. And you bring with it a celebratory sacrifice, I just learned. It's possible to bring it in impurity if most of the community is impure by a corpse, as we explained. Aval Pesach Sheni, but with the second Passover, chametz u'matzah imay babayis. You could have chametz and matzah in the same home. The eineton halal ba'achila, say no need to say halal when you eat it. Umaitzi and they say chutz lachabura, saying you can take it from company to company. The ein mevi nimei chagiga, you don't bring a celebratory sacrifice with it. The ein babetuma, and it never comes in a state of impurity. Ushneim, but both the first and the second do share some things. Deichenes Shabbos, they override Shabbos. If that's the day to bring it, that's the day to bring it. Utunen halal ba'asiyasan, when you offer it in the temple, there was always halal recited. V'necholin sali, bebayis echad, al matzah umarer, they must be eaten roasted in one home, together with matzah and bitter herbs. Ve'ein meisidid mehen, ve'ein shevidin b'hanesa etzem, no leaving over, and no breaking their bones. Asks the Rambam the question, what's the reason for these differences? Why don't we compare the second to the first for all matters? When Moshe introduced the law of the Pesach Sheni, he says the words, you do it like all the laws of the Pesach. Wouldn't that sound like everything should be equal? Says the Rambam, but examine the verses. Because Moshe did delineate some of the laws, he didn't just say blanketly, hey, do it like the first Pesach. He repeats some of the laws. That teaches you it's only equal to the first one in the laws that were delineated. The laws that apply to its body. And that's the words chukas haPesach, which Moshe Rabbeinu means to include only the ones that were delineated here, but not the ones that don't apply to the body of the actual Passover sacrifice. Those don't apply by the Pesach Sheni. And the Rambam concludes, that which we find in the first Passover, by the Exodus from Egypt, a very special law, that the Passover sacrifice needs to be put aside on the 10th day of Nisan, 4 days before Pesach. And the fact that there has to be some blood sprinkled with a band of hyssop to the lintel and to the doorpost, that's where you apply the blood, and it should be eaten in a hurry. Those things didn't apply for all generations. They were only performed in that special Passover of Egypt because of those circumstances, but forevermore, those do not apply. And blessed is Hashem, who grants us assistance. Mazel tov for concluding the laws of Korban Pesach.